The silence of a man who has endured too much is not empty. It is a space where storms gather, where resolve hardens into steel, and where the plans for justice are drawn in the quiet dark. For 5 years, Ethan Hayes had been a master of silence, a quiet observer in a world of deafening noise. But on a humid summer night in the Hamptons, his silence was about to transform from a shield of endurance into a weapon of war. The occasion was the 30th anniversary party for Eleanor and the late Richard Vance, a celebration less about memory and more about the continued projection of power. Hundreds of guests, the glittering and the gilded of New York society, moved like schools of exotic fish through the sprawling gardens of the Vance estate. Champagne flowed from fountains, music drifted from a string quartet, and the air was thick with the scent of money and night-blooming jasmine. Ethan stood near a marble balustrade, a ghost at the feast. He wore a tailored suit that had cost more than his first car, but he felt as out of place as a librarian in a casino. He watched his wife, Isabella, glide through the crowd, a vision in couture, her laughter bright and brittle. For years, he had navigated these events with a polite, practiced invisibility, absorbing the subtle slights from his mother-in-law, Eleanor, and the boorish jokes from his brother-in-law, Julian. He endured it all for the woman he loved, the woman he still believed existed somewhere beneath the polished Vance veneer. Then, the music softened. Eleanor, regal and imposing, stepped onto a small, illuminated stage, her daughter Isabella at her side. A hush fell over the crowd as they expected a toast, a sentimental tribute to a late husband and a glorious marriage. Eleanor smiled, a tight, predatory curving of her lips, and raised a microphone. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate the Vance legacy," she began, her voice carrying across the lawn. "A legacy of strength, of standards, and of making the right choices, no matter how difficult." She turned and placed a hand on Isabella's shoulder. "It is in that spirit," she continued, "that my daughter has an announcement. She has made a difficult, but correct, choice to secure her future happiness." Isabella stepped forward, her smile as dazzling and cold as the diamond necklace at her throat. "For 5 years," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I have been engaged in what I can only describe as a charitable mistake." A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the crowd. She did not look at Ethan, but her words were aimed at him like a volley of arrows. "But I am thrilled to say that I have finally corrected that error. I have found a man who is my true equal." On cue, a handsome, suave man named Lucas stepped from the side of the stage and took Isabella's hand, kissing it for the benefit of the audience. The humiliation was a public spectacle, a carefully staged execution of a man's worth. Eleanor delivered the final, fatal blow. "Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as she finally addressed him across the garden, "naturally, you will receive nothing. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. Our lawyers have already frozen the accounts. I expect you to be gone from our house by morning." The whispers of the crowd turned into poorly concealed snickers. Ethan felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, feasting on his disgrace. But he did not shout. He did not beg. He did not even flinch. All the pain, all the years of quiet suffering and swallowed insults coalesced in that one moment, not into rage, but into a profound, terrifying clarity. The man they were mocking was a stranger to him now. The life they were destroying was a cage he was finally free of. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, and met Eleanor's triumphant gaze. Then, he gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of defeat, it was a nod of acknowledgement, a silent acceptance of the terms of war. Without a word, he turned his back on the stage, on the pointing fingers and cruel laughter, on his wife, on the entire glittering, rotten edifice of his life. He walked calmly through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were a leper, and he did not stop until the iron gates of the estate closed behind him, shutting out the noise forever. The storm had finally gathered, and the quiet dark had begun. To understand the storm, you must first understand the silence that came before it. Ethan's life within the Vance family was a long, deep, and profound silence, a quiet endurance that lasted for 5 excruciating years. He was not born into their world of inherited wealth and hollow prestige, a world built on the manicured lawns of the Hamptons and fortified by the cold marble of their Manhattan penthouse. He had entered it through a side door, the one reserved for scholarship students and improbable dreams, the one he walked through when he met Isabella. Ethan was an orphan, a child raised by the indifferent hand of the state. But where circumstance had given him nothing, nature had given him a mind of formidable clarity. He saw the world in patterns, in data, in the subtle currents that flowed beneath the surface of things. It was this mind that earned him a full scholarship to Columbia, where he studied finance and economics not as a path to riches, but as a way to understand the architecture of the world that had, until then, ignored him. He was quiet, not out of shyness, but because he was always listening, always observing. Isabella Vance was the opposite of silence. She was a symphony of laughter, designer clothes, and effortless charisma. To Ethan, she was a sun flare in his grayscale world. When they met in a university library, she was captivated by his intensity, by the calm depth in his eyes that seemed to see right through the noise of her social circle. He didn't care about the name Vance. He cared about her thoughts on Keynesian economics. For a brief, shining moment, their differences were not a chasm, but a source of fascination. He offered her substance, and she offered him a glimpse of a life he had only ever read about. Their love, in the beginning, felt real enough to build a bridge across that chasm. But a bridge built by one person alone is destined to collapse. The first crack appeared when he met her family. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, was a woman carved from ice and ambition. She viewed Ethan not as a person, but as a ledger entry that didn't balance. Her smile never reached her eyes, which performed a constant dismissive audit of his suit, his haircut, his choice of words. She would praise him in ways that were, in fact, insults. "It's truly remarkable," she'd say at dinner parties, "what some people can achieve with so little to start with." The words sounded like a compliment, but the tone declared him a specimen, a fascinating insect under glass. Her son, Julian, was a cruder instrument of the family's disdain. Where his mother used a scalpel, Julian used a hammer. He was a man who had been handed everything and had earned nothing, leaving him with a deep-seated insecurity that he masked with arrogance. He called Ethan Captain Scholarship, or the intern. During family gatherings, Julian would loudly recount tales of his latest extravagant purchase, a yacht or a racehorse, before turning to Ethan and asking, "So, Ethan, what's the biggest check you've ever written? For rent, I presume?" The laughter that followed was always sharp, and always at Ethan's expense. Isabella would squeeze Ethan's hand under the table, a gesture that was supposed to be comforting, but felt more like an admission of shared helplessness. Ethan's life became a masterclass in self-effacement. He was a brilliant financial analyst, a man who could see a market crash coming months away by reading the faint tremors in the data. Yet, in the Vance family's business discussions, his opinions were treated as novelties, the charming musings of a child. He once tried to warn them about a risky real estate venture Julian was championing, presenting a detailed report filled with irrefutable data. Eleanor glanced at the first page, then handed it back with a thin smile. "Thank you, Ethan. That's very thorough. But let's leave the big decisions to the people who understand the family's legacy. They lost millions on that deal, a loss that was never mentioned again, but Ethan learned his lesson. His value was not in his mind, but in his silence. His willingness to be the silent, agreeable husband to a Vance daughter. He endured it for Isabella. He clung to the memory of the girl in the library, the one who loved his mind, not his pedigree. But the girl was fading, being overwritten by the woman who had to defend her choice of husband at every brunch and charity gala. She began to police him, gently at first, then with an edge of desperation. "Darling, maybe don't wear that tie. It looks a bit academic. Or perhaps just listen during dinner tonight. The conversation is about family trusts. It would only bore you." Each suggestion was a small death, the chipping away of the man she had claimed to love. He was being sanded down, reshaped to fit into a space he was never designed for. The house itself felt alien. It was less a home and more a museum of the Vance ego. Every surface was polished. Every object was an artifact with a price tag. Ethan felt like a trespasser, constantly afraid of leaving a fingerprint on their perfect, sterile world. He would retreat to his small study, the one room they had begrudgingly given him, and lose himself in market data streams. It was the only place where the numbers made sense, where cause and effect were real, unlike the arbitrary and cruel rules of his new family. He was a ghost at their feast, a shadow in their sunlit rooms, tolerated but never, ever accepted. He tolerated the condescension from Eleanor, the open mockery from Julian, and the slow, painful drift of his wife, all because he believed his love was a fortress. He believed that if he just worked hard enough, was quiet enough, was patient enough, they would eventually see him for who he was. He thought his endurance was a sign of strength, a testament to his commitment. He did not yet understand that to the Vances, his endurance was simply confirmation of his weakness. It proved what they had always believed, that he was so desperate for their world, so grateful for the scraps from their table, that he would accept any humiliation to stay. He absorbed their slights, their insults, their dismissive glances, storing them away in a deep, quiet place inside him. He didn't realize he wasn't just absorbing them. He was collecting them, like a debt collector marking down every unpaid invoice, waiting for the day of reckoning. For 5 years, he paid their price in silence, holding on to the foolish hope that the Isabella he married was still in there, waiting for him. That was his greatest miscalculation. He thought he was in a marriage, when in fact, he was merely in a long, drawn-out audition, and the final decision on his role had already been made without his knowledge. Betrayal rarely arrives like a thunderclap. More often, it is a slow leak, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of a life. For Ethan, the air in his marriage to Isabella had been growing thin for months. It was in the spaces between her words, the phone calls she started taking on the terrace, the way her laughter, once a shared joy, became a private currency spent with others. He, a man who built his life on identifying patterns, could not ignore the emerging data. The pattern was one of withdrawal, of a life being lived in parallel to his own, its trajectory slowly, but surely, veering away. The first tangible proof, the first hard data point in his theory of betrayal, came on a Tuesday afternoon. He had come home early from the office, a rare occasion, hoping to surprise Isabella. As he walked through the cavernous marble foyer, he heard her voice drifting from the sunroom. It was light, effervescent, and laced with a genuine mirth he hadn't heard directed at him in years. He paused, hidden by the archway, an unintentional eavesdropper in his own home. "No, Lucas, you can't say that," she giggled, a sound like sparkling wine. "He's not a monster. He's just a project, a charity project that ran its course." A pause. I know. But Mother is handling the exit strategy. It has to be clean. We can't have him making a scene." Ethan stood perfectly still, the silence in his ears roaring louder than her words. He felt the blood drain from his face. A project, a charity case. The words didn't just sting, they recontextualized 5 years of his life, turning every sacrifice, every moment of endured humiliation, into an act of pathetic naivety. Then came the final, crushing phrase. "Soon," Isabella said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, "we'll be able to start our real life. Just imagine it. No more dead weight." Dead weight, that was him. The anchor she had been dragging along, pretending it was a companion. In that moment, something inside Ethan didn't break, but rather calcified. The warm, beating heart of a hopeful husband was encased in something cold, hard, and analytical. He retreated as silently as he had arrived, his mind not reeling with chaotic emotion, but clicking with a terrible, newfound clarity. An emotional confrontation was pointless. Arguing with her would be like arguing with a weather report. The storm was already coming, and feelings were irrelevant to its path. That night, he didn't sleep. He went to his study, the small, tolerated space that was his alone, and he did the one thing that had always made sense to him. He sought the truth in the numbers. He wasn't a jealous husband searching for love letters or scandalous texts. That was a game of emotion, a game he had already lost. He was a financial analyst investigating a hostile takeover of his own life. His entry point was a discrepancy he had noticed weeks ago, but had dismissed a small, recurring transfer from a joint trust fund to an LLC he didn't recognize. Isabella had called it a charitable art investment. With cold precision, Ethan began to pull on that thread. He cross-referenced the LLC's registration details. It was a shell corporation based in Delaware, anonymous by design. But the registration agent was a law firm he recognized, the same firm that Lucas, Isabella's new man, used for his private equity fund. It was a weak link, but it was enough. Ethan worked through the night, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the monitor. He was a surgeon, methodically cutting through layers of legal jargon and financial firewalls. He followed the money. The small transfers from their trust fund were just the beginning. He unearthed a complex web of transactions, a systematic siphoning of Isabella's personal assets into this corporate entity, co-managed by Lucas. They weren't just planning a divorce. They were orchestrating a financial extraction, moving her wealth beyond the reach of any potential settlement, ensuring he would be left with absolutely nothing but the public humiliation they were planning. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a premeditated financial execution. They had analyzed him, his passivity, his lack of familial power, and deemed him a non-threat, a piece of inconvenient baggage to be disposed of with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The pain of the affair was a dull ache now, completely overshadowed by the sharp, clarifying rage of being so utterly underestimated. They didn't just think he was poor, they thought he was stupid. And in that moment of profound betrayal, Ethan made a decision. He would not confront her. He would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. He would play the role they had assigned him, the oblivious, pitiable husband. He would continue to smile politely at the dinner table. He would continue to endure Julian's taunts and Eleanor's condescension, but he would no longer be a victim. He would be an observer, a data collector. His silence, once a shield of endurance, now became a weapon of reconnaissance. He started digging deeper, not just into Isabella's finances, but into the entire Vance empire. For years, out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, he had turned a blind eye to the questionable accounting practices and ethically dubious deals he'd glimpsed. Now, he looked again, with the cold, impartial eyes of an outside auditor. He copied files. He downloaded ledgers. He created a timeline of every suspect transaction, every inflated asset, every hidden liability. He was mapping their kingdom, not to save it, but to learn the location of every structural weakness, every fault line. He worked in the dead of night, creating an encrypted archive of their sins, a digital war chest. His pain and heartbreak were being compressed, forged under immense pressure into a single, diamond-hard objective: to survive, and to show them, in the clearest language they understood, the language of power and money, what a monumental miscalculation they had made. The upcoming 30th anniversary party was no longer a date on the calendar to be dreaded. It was the designated event horizon, the point of no return. He would walk into that party as Ethan Hayes, the charity case, but he would walk out as someone else entirely. The closing of a gate can be the loudest sound in the world. As the ornate iron gates of the Vance estate swung shut behind him, the click of the lock echoed with the finality of a coffin being sealed. Inside, the muffled sound of music and laughter continued, a world of light and warmth that had just violently ejected him. Outside, there was only the cold night air, the gravel crunching under his uselessly expensive shoes, and the profound, deafening silence of absolute loss. He was no longer Ethan Hayes, husband to Isabella Vance. He was just a man in a suit, standing on the side of a dark road in the Hamptons, with nowhere to go. The severing was as swift and brutal as a guillotine. He walked for what felt like miles before a taxi finally appeared. The first sign of his new reality came at an ATM in a 24-hour convenience store. He inserted his debit card, the one linked to their primary joint account. Insufficient funds. He tried again. The same sterile, damning message. He called the bank's automated line. The polite, robotic voice informed him that the account, along with 2 others, had been closed earlier that day. Of course, Eleanor's exit strategy was nothing if not efficient. Every financial artery connecting him to their world had been clamped and severed. He paid the taxi driver with most of the cash in his wallet, asking to be dropped off at the cheapest motel the driver knew on the edge of the city. The place smelled of stale smoke and desperation. The fluorescent light in the hallway flickered over peeling wallpaper, a constant, buzzing reminder of his descent. He sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, the tailored suit he had worn to the party feeling like a costume from a play that had just ended. He was a king in exile, only he had never been a king, just a well-dressed court jester who had forgotten his place. In the first 48 hours, he went through the motions of a man trying to prove he still existed. He called a few men from his social circle, men with whom he had shared expensive scotch, and talked about market trends. The responses were a case study in evasion. One, a man named Robert who had clapped him on the back just hours earlier, sounded genuinely flustered. "Ethan, my God," I heard. "Listen, this is very awkward. My firm manages a significant portion of the Vance portfolio. You understand." He didn't say I have to choose a side, but the words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Another so-called friend didn't even offer an excuse, his voice turning cold and distant. "I think it's best if you don't call this number again." The social architecture of his life was built on the foundation of the Vance name, and with that foundation gone, the entire structure had crumbled into dust. By the third day, a gnawing hunger had replaced the initial shock. He had $27 left. The suit was a mockery, a prison of fine wool. He found a pawn shop in a forgotten corner of Queens, the kind of place that trades in broken dreams. He took off the watch Isabella had given him for their 3rd anniversary, a platinum timepiece worth more than the car he used to drive. The pawnbroker, a man with weary eyes that had seen it all, offered him a few $100s, a pittance of its value. Ethan didn't bargain. He traded the symbol of his gilded cage for the currency of survival. The act was a baptism. With the cool cash in his pocket and the weight gone from his wrist, he felt a strange sense of lightness. He had nothing, which meant he had nothing left to lose. He bought a change of clothes, jeans, a plain shirt, and a bus ticket. The destination wasn't a place, but a direction. Back to the gritty, unpretentious streets of the Bronx neighborhood where he had grown up in a series of foster homes. As the bus rattled through the city, the gleaming skyscrapers of Manhattan gave way to the familiar brick and fire escapes of his past. He wasn't returning as a success story, the boy who had made it out. He was returning as a refugee, seeking asylum from a life that had proven to be a lie. He found his oldest friend, Marco, covered in grease, under the hood of a 1982 sedan in the small auto repair shop he owned. Marco looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and took in Ethan's haggard appearance. There was no judgment in his eyes, no surprise, only a weary recognition. "I figured I'd be seeing you sooner or later," he said, his voice rough but kind. "You look like hell. Come on, my sister made lasagna." That simple act of unconditional acceptance did more to heal him than any therapy could. For 2 weeks, Ethan slept on Marco's lumpy couch. By day, he worked in the garage. He changed oil, rotated tires, and felt the satisfying ache of physical labor in his muscles. The grease that stained his hands felt cleaner than the polite handshakes of his former life. He was reconnecting with a part of himself he had suppressed for years, the resilient survivor who knew how to make something out of nothing. Surrounded by the honest sounds of rattling wrenches and Marco's booming laughter, the ghost of the Vance family began to recede. It was during a quiet evening, sitting on the stoop of the garage, that the memory surfaced. It came to him unbidden. A flicker of light in the darkness. The quiet, wood-paneled corner of the public library, and the kind, intelligent eyes of an old man named Arthur Pendleton. He remembered their conversations, the way Mr. Pendleton would listen, truly listen, as Ethan spoke about economic theories and market volatility. The old man had seen his mind, not his clothes or his connections. He had treated Ethan not as a charity case or a social climber, but as an intellectual peer. In a world that had just proven to be utterly fake, that memory felt like the only real thing he had left. The thought wasn't a plan, not yet. It was just a question. a flicker of curiosity in the vast emptiness of his future. He wondered what had become of the old man. Hitting rock bottom had been a brutal, painful fall, but it had also brought an unexpected clarity. It had stripped away everything that wasn't real, leaving only the ground beneath his feet and the faintest memory of a genuine human connection, a thread he knew, with sudden certainty, he had to follow. The grime of the auto shop felt honest, but it wasn't his world. After 2 weeks of finding himself in the rhythm of physical work, Ethan knew he couldn't stay. His mind, the most powerful tool he possessed, was lying dormant, and a new, quiet resolve had taken root in the ruins of his old life. He needed to follow the thread that led back to Arthur Pendleton, the one man who had seen that mind and valued it. He thanked Marco, who simply nodded, understanding that this was a journey Ethan had to make alone. His first stop was the place where it all began, the hushed, cathedral-like quiet of the New York Public Library. He found the same corner where he and the old man had spent countless hours, the air still smelling of aged paper and wood polish. The librarian, a woman named Miss Albright with kind, discerning eyes, recognized him immediately. "Mr. Hayes," she said, a gentle smile on her face. "It's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about your troubles." The news of his public disgrace had traveled, it seemed, even to the quiet corners of the world. Ethan gave a weak smile. "I was hoping to find Mr. Pendleton. Is he around?" Miss Albright's expression softened with sadness. "Oh, my dear boy, I'm so sorry. Arthur passed away almost 2 months ago. It was very peaceful in his sleep." The word struck Ethan with an unexpected force. He had come seeking a connection to his past, a flicker of hope, only to find another door closed, another light extinguished. He felt a profound and genuine grief for the kind, brilliant man he had considered a friend, perhaps the only real friend he'd had in years. He had lost again. He thanked the librarian and turned to leave, the weight of his solitude returning, heavier than before. "Wait, Mr. Hayes," she called out, stopping him. She went behind her desk and retrieved a crisp, white business card. "Arthur left this for me. He said, if the young man with the analyst's mind ever comes looking for me, give him this. He'll know what to do." Ethan took the card. It was thick, expensive cardstock, embossed with the name of a prestigious law firm, Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch. Below it was a handwritten name, Mr. Elias Vance. It felt like a message from beyond the grave, a final move in a game of chess he didn't even know he was playing. A tremor of something not hope, but intense curiosity ran through him. The next day, wearing the best of his newly purchased simple clothes, he walked into a lobby of dark wood and quiet money that was all too familiar, yet entirely different. The receptionist didn't look down on him. She greeted him with professional deference. He was not an imposter here. He was an invited guest. He was led to a corner office with a panoramic view of Central Park. Mr. Elias Vance, a man in his late 70s with a gaze as sharp and clear as a diamond, stood to greet him. He was nothing like the Vances Ethan knew. There was no arrogance in his posture, only a deep, abiding gravity. "Mr. Hayes," the lawyer began, gesturing for him to sit. "I was a friend and the executor of the estate of a man you knew as Arthur Pendleton. His real name, however, was Alistair Blackwood." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Alistair Blackwood wasn't just a name, it was a legend, a ghost of Wall Street, a brilliant, iconoclastic investor who had built a colossal fortune in the 70s and 80s before vanishing from public life entirely. He was rumored to be a recluse, a myth, and Ethan had been discussing economic policy with him over lukewarm coffee in a public library. Mr. Vance continued, "Alistair was a keen observer of people. He believed character was the most undervalued asset on the market. He met you years ago and has been following your career, so to speak. He was deeply impressed by your intellect, but more so by your integrity, which he saw being tested and eroded by the family you married into." The lawyer slid a thick document across the polished desk. "This is a summary of his last will and testament. Alistair had no children. He has left the bulk of his fortune to various charities. However, he made a specific, and I must say, highly unusual provision for you. He cleared his throat. Alistair has bequeathed to you a seed investment portfolio, currently valued at $500,000. Ethan stared, speechless. It was a lifeline, a restart button on a life that had been wiped clean. But before he could even process the number, Mr. Vance held up a hand. That is the lesser part of your inheritance, Mr. Hayes. Alistair was firm in his belief that true wealth is not money, but knowledge. Your real inheritance is this. The lawyer reached into a briefcase and placed a heavy, worn, leather-bound ledger on the desk. It felt ancient, sacred. Ethan reached out and touched the soft, worn leather. That, Mr. Vance said with a tone of reverence, was Alistair Blackwood's private ledger. His life's work. It contains every major investment thesis he ever developed, his strategies, his private notes on the psychology of the market. He called it his map of greed. The lawyer leaned forward, and for reasons of his own, it also contains a detailed, multi-year analysis of the structural and financial weaknesses of one particular corporation, Vance Enterprises. It all clicked into place. The pointed questions about the Vance family's business, the knowing look in Arthur's and Alistair's eyes. This wasn't a random act of kindness. It was a deliberate, targeted endowment. It was an arsenal. Ethan was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions, grief for his lost friend, shock at the revelation of his identity, and a profound, humbling sense of gratitude. Alistair hadn't just given him money, he had given him validation. He had given him a weapon. He had seen the quiet, analytical man drowning in a sea of arrogance and had thrown him not a life raft, but the schematics to a battleship. After signing the necessary papers in a daze, Ethan left the law office, carrying the heavy ledger as if it were a holy text. He found a quiet bench in Central Park, the autumn leaves swirling around him, and opened it. On the first page, in a familiar, elegant script, was a note. Ethan, it read, they think the game is about money, about pedigree, about who you know. They are fools playing checkers. The real game is about seeing what others do not and having the courage to act on it. You have the vision. I have merely provided the tools. Go show them what you see. A. B. The last vestiges of the broken, humiliated man who had been cast out of the Vance mansion evaporated in that moment. The pain was still there, but it had been transmuted, repurposed from a source of suffering into a source of fuel. He was no longer a victim adrift in the wreckage of his life. He was the heir to a legend, the custodian of a master's knowledge, and the agent of a justice that had been waiting, patiently, in the pages of an old book. The silence was over. A storm was coming, and for the first time, he knew he would be the one to command it. Ethan did not use Alistair Blackwood's money to reclaim his old life. That life was a cage, and he had no desire to re-gild its bars. Instead, he rented a small, Spartan apartment in an anonymous building in a part of the city where no one knew his name. It was a command center, a war room. There was a mattress on the floor, a single chair, a desk, and a powerful computer. The walls, once bare, were quickly covered in whiteboards, which he filled with complex diagrams, financial charts, and timelines. His life simplified into a singular, monastic focus, the ledger. For weeks, he did nothing but absorb the contents of that book. It was not a simple collection of tips and tricks. It was the distilled wisdom of a master, a philosophical treatise on the nature of power disguised as a financial journal. Alistair wrote about markets not as abstract forces, but as living ecosystems, driven by the predictable, primal emotions of greed and fear. He taught Ethan to look past the balance sheets and press releases and to read the character of the men running the companies. Arrogance, he wrote, was the most exploitable liability a CEO could have. The section on Vance Enterprises was a masterpiece of clinical dissection. Alistair had been studying them for years, with the detached curiosity of a biologist examining a flawed specimen. He had mapped every vulnerability, every point of leverage. He noted Eleanor's obsession with social status, which led the company to overspend on vanity projects. He detailed Julian's incompetence and his penchant for high-risk, low-reward ventures to prove himself. He analyzed their debt structure, revealing that the entire glittering empire was built on a dangerously over-leveraged foundation. They were a house of cards, standing only because no one had ever dared to blow on it. Alistair's notes provided the how, but it was the quiet fury in Ethan's own heart that provided the why. A crude plan would be to short their stock, to drive them into bankruptcy. But that was messy, loud. It was the revenge of a common brawler. Alistair's methods and Ethan's own analytical nature demanded something more elegant, more poetic. Justice should not be a quick execution. It should be a slow, meticulous dismantling, a reversal of power so complete that they would be forced to live in the shadow of the man they had discarded. The goal crystallized in his mind, perfect and absolute. He wouldn't just bankrupt them, he would own them. He would become their creditor, their regulator, their master. He would become their landlord, both literally and figuratively. With the objective defined, he began to build the instrument of his will. He returned to the offices of Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch. With Mr. Vance's expert guidance, he used a portion of the seed money to erect a corporate fortress. He founded a private equity firm, naming it Phoenix Holdings. The name was a private, bitter joke, a promise to himself of what he would become. Phoenix Holdings was designed to be a ghost. It existed only on paper, in a labyrinth of nested shell corporations and offshore accounts, from Delaware to the Cayman Islands. All transactions were routed through proxies and cutouts, with Mr. Vance's venerable law firm acting as the final, impenetrable firewall. To the outside world, Phoenix Holdings would have no face, no single owner. It would be a mysterious, unstoppable force in the market. Ethan Hayes, the disgraced husband, had ceased to exist. In his place was a phantom, an invisible hand directing the flow of capital. His first move was a lesson in Alistair's doctrine of indirect warfare. Attacking Vance Enterprises directly would be foolish. It would trigger their defenses. Instead, he targeted their ecosystem. The ledger identified a key vulnerability: a mid-sized logistics company, Starkweather Transport, which held the exclusive distribution contract for the Vance's entire retail division. Starkweather was a family-owned business, competent but financially stretched, carrying a significant amount of debt that was coming due. Working from his Spartan apartment, Ethan, through the anonymous apparatus of Phoenix Holdings, began to quietly buy that debt from the various creditors. It was a delicate operation, done in small parcels to avoid raising alarms. He was a shark, circling a swimmer, never showing his fin. Within a month, Phoenix Holdings had become the majority holder of Starkweather Transport's debt. They were, for all intents and purposes, the company's new bank. The final step was a simple, formal letter. Sent from the offices of Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch on behalf of their client, Phoenix Holdings, the letter informed the CEO of Starkweather that their debt had been consolidated and was now owned by a new, single entity. It offered them more favorable repayment terms and a potential infusion of capital, on one condition: absolute discretion and loyalty to their new financial partner. The CEO, terrified of bankruptcy, agreed immediately. No one at Vance Enterprises knew a thing. Their shipments continued to arrive on time. Their quarterly reports showed business as usual. Yet, a fundamental shift in the power dynamic had occurred. Ethan now had a listening post inside their operations. He controlled a critical piece of their supply chain. He hadn't fired a single shot, but he had captured a vital outpost in their territory. That night, Ethan stood before the whiteboards in his apartment. In the center of a complex web, he had written Vance Enterprises. Now, with a black marker, he drew a single, solid line from Phoenix Holdings to Starkweather Transport, and from there, a dotted line to the Vance name. It was the first thread in a web that would eventually ensnare them all. A cold, thin smile touched his lips for the first time in months. The plan was no longer a dream scribbled in a dead man's book. It was alive, it was in motion, and it was utterly invisible. For the next 18 months, Ethan Hayes ceased to exist. He became a ghost, a disembodied intelligence whose only presence was the silent, devastating impact he had on the market. His world shrank to the four walls of his apartment, the glowing screens of his monitors, and the timeless wisdom of Alistair Blackwood's ledger. He lived by the rhythm of the global markets, rising hours before the opening bell in New York to analyze the pre-market tremors from Asia and Europe. He ate, slept, and breathed data, his life distilled into a singular, relentless pursuit of capital and leverage. He was no longer a man. He was Phoenix Holdings. His ascent was silent and spectacular. Guided by Alistair's principles, he didn't engage in the loud, brutish tactics of common corporate raiders. He practiced a form of financial martial arts, using the market's own weight and momentum against itself. He learned to exploit the most dangerous and predictable of all market forces, human ego. He targeted a tech firm run by a notoriously arrogant CEO, a man Alistair had described in the ledger as a peacock who mistakes his own feathers for the Sunday. Through encrypted channels and anonymous forums, Ethan's proxies leaked a carefully fabricated rumor about a competitor's breakthrough. As predicted, the CEO panicked, making a series of rash, defensive acquisitions that crippled his company's finances. As the company's stock plummeted, Phoenix Holdings swept in, buying a controlling interest for pennies on the dollar, restructuring the leadership, and tripling its investment in 6 months. He also became a builder in the shadows. His analysis identified a small, overlooked biotech firm with a revolutionary drug patent, but no capital to get through clinical trials. The Vances of the world would never touch such a venture. It lacked the pedigree and glamour of real estate or luxury goods. But Ethan saw the pure, unadulterated value in the data. Phoenix Holdings funded the trials, providing not just capital, but a strategic roadmap based on Alistair's models for navigating regulatory hurdles. When the drug was approved, the firm's value exploded. The initial investment multiplied 100-fold. With each silent victory, Ethan's war chest grew from thousands into millions, then tens of millions. He became a whisper on Wall Street, a myth. Traders would speak of a ghost in the market, a new, unseen player who moved with terrifying prescience and precision, buying just before a stock soared and selling moments before it crashed. They never knew it was the quiet, dismissed son-in-law of one of New York's most prominent families, operating from a bare apartment with nothing but a computer and a dead man's knowledge. While Ethan's empire was being forged in discipline and silence, the Vance empire was beginning to rot from the inside, a decline born of arrogance and indolence. With Ethan gone, Julian was given more responsibility, which he wielded with the finesse of a sledgehammer. He championed the family's investment in a gaudy, overpriced luxury hotel in Dubai, a classic vanity project. He ignored feasibility studies and market saturation warnings, seduced by the glamour of the deal. The project became a financial black hole, sucking millions of dollars out of the company's reserves with no hope of a return. Isabella's new fiancé, Lucas, was an even more insidious poison. He was a con artist wrapped in the flag of old money. He flattered Eleanor's ego and encouraged Julian's recklessness, all while steering Vance Enterprises into a series of convoluted, high-risk derivative trades managed by his own offshore firm. He was a vampire, and the Vances, blinded by his charm and pedigree, had invited him into their home and offered him their throat. Isabella, meanwhile, was blissfully occupied with planning a wedding that would be the social event of the season, oblivious to the fact that its funding was being drawn from a rapidly crumbling foundation. Eleanor, the formidable matriarch, was the architect of her own demise. She saw the quarterly losses and the mounting debt, but her pride was an impenetrable shield against reality. She dismissed the warnings of her own accountants as professional pessimism. In her mind, the Vances were an institution, as permanent and solid as the bedrock of Manhattan itself. The idea that her son could be incompetent, or that her daughter's chosen partner could be anything less than sterling, was simply not a possibility she was capable of entertaining. The contrast was a study in cosmic irony. In his Spartan apartment, Ethan, fueled by black coffee and cold fury, was creating real, tangible value. Miles away, in their lavish penthouse, the Vances were toasting their own genius with vintage champagne, presiding over a bonfire of their ancestral wealth. Ethan watched their slow-motion self-destruction through the cold, impartial lens of financial news reports and the discreet, detailed updates he now received from his contact inside Starkweather Transport. He felt no glee, no schadenfreude. He felt only the grim satisfaction of a mathematician watching a complex equation solve itself exactly as predicted. Every foolish decision they made, every dollar they wasted, was a confirmation of Alistair's thesis on the fatal weakness of their character. He was patient. He continued to build his arsenal, to grow Phoenix Holdings into a predator so large and powerful that when it finally decided to strike, the outcome would be beyond doubt. He was not just planning a hostile takeover. He was planning an extinction-level event. The ghost had spent long enough gathering its strength in the shadows. The market was beginning to notice the stench of decay from the House of Vance. Their credit rating was quietly downgraded. A story in the Wall Street Journal questioned their recent high-risk strategies. To the Vances, these were minor annoyances, the jealous whispers of lesser men. To Ethan, they were the tremors before the earthquake. The foundations were now sufficiently cracked. The time for indirect pressure was over. The haunting was about to begin in earnest. The first rule of a predator is to let the prey wound itself. For months, Ethan watched from the shadows as Vance Enterprises did just that. Julian's disastrous Dubai hotel became an insatiable maw, devouring capital with no return. Lucas's fraudulent investments acted as a slow, steady hemorrhage of their remaining liquid assets. The company was bleeding, and the Vances, in their insulated world of privilege, reacted not with concern, but with indignation. They blamed a hostile market, predatory regulators, the jealousy of their competitors, everyone but the architects of their own decline sitting around their own dinner table. Their solution, born of desperation and ego, was predictable. They needed to stop the bleeding, not by stitching the wound, but by getting a massive transfusion. They decided to take on more debt, to paper over the gaping holes in their balance sheet with a fresh mountain of borrowed cash. But the name Vance, once a golden key that unlocked the vaults of Wall Street's most prestigious banks, had lost its luster. The major lenders saw the risk, the stench of decay beneath the designer suits, and politely declined. Forced into the financial back alleys, the Vances had to turn to aggressive, second-tier credit funds, vultures who offered cash at punishingly high interest rates, with covenants and conditions that were nothing short of draconian. They were saving their company by selling its soul. From his apartment, Ethan watched this development with the cold, predatory calm of a crocodile, sensing a struggling wildebeest. This was the moment Alistair's ledger had prepared him for. He did not rush in. He waited. He let the Vances sign the toxic loan agreements. He let them feel a moment of false relief as the new money hit their accounts, a momentary reprieve they celebrated with another lavish party. And then, when the ink was dry and the champagne was gone, Phoenix Holdings began its work. The operation was a masterclass in financial stealth. Phoenix, now a formidable entity with tens of millions in assets, did not lend the Vances a single dollar directly. Instead, Ethan began to hunt the hunters. Through Mr. Vance's law firm, he approached the very credit funds that had just loaned money to the Vances. He offered to buy the Vance debt from them. His offer was simple and compelling. A small, immediate, and guaranteed profit. For these lenders, who specialized in high-risk, high-reward loans, the chance to offload a volatile asset like the Vances for a sure thing was too good to refuse. One by one, they sold their positions. Simultaneously, on the open secondary market, Phoenix was quietly buying up the older, long-term corporate bonds issued by Vance Enterprises years ago, acquiring them at a deep discount as investor confidence in the company plummeted. Within 6 months of the Vances' desperate borrowing spree, a silent, monumental shift had occurred. Phoenix Holdings had become the owner of nearly 70% of their total outstanding debt. The various chains they had placed around their own necks now all led back to a single, invisible hand, Ethan's. They had borrowed their way into a prison, and their estranged, forgotten son-in-law had just become the warden. With control of their financial lifeline secured, Ethan began to slowly, methodically, tighten the noose. The psychological warfare phase of his plan had begun. The market, already wary of the Vances, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Ethan provided it. Anonymous, meticulously sourced research reports began to circulate among influential financial blogs and forums. These reports contained no lies, only the brutal, unvarnished truth, stripped of the Vance's public relations spin. They highlighted the disastrous cash flow from the Dubai project, questioned the company's ability to service its massive new debt load, and pointed to Julian Vance's track record of failed initiatives. The stock, already weak, began to hemorrhage value. Then came the direct pressure. Cold, formal letters from Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch began arriving at the Vance Tower. As the representative for their largest creditor, the letters were impossible to ignore. They were no longer polite inquiries, they were demands. Phoenix Holdings invoked its rights as a creditor, demanding more frequent and detailed financial disclosures. They questioned the justification for Eleanor's extravagant executive expense account. They vetoed a proposed multi-million-dollar management success fee for Julian. Every letter was a reminder of their powerlessness, a sharp tug on their leash. The Vances were caught in an invisible vice. They were being squeezed, but they couldn't see who was applying the pressure. Their arrogance curdled into a frantic, bewildered paranoia. Julian, in a televised interview, raged against shadowy short sellers and corporate saboteurs who were trying to destroy his family's legacy. Eleanor made a flurry of calls to her old money contacts, trying to project an aura of calm and control, only to be met with polite evasions and whispered rumors. They were fighting a ghost, a phantom enemy who knew their every weakness and seemed to anticipate their every move. Amidst the chaos he was orchestrating, Ethan's focus remained laser-sharp on the ultimate prize, the symbol of their hubris, the Vance Tower. The gleaming skyscraper was more than just a headquarters, it was the family's crown jewel. As Alistair's ledger had noted, it was also heavily mortgaged. With the company's revenue in freefall and its cash reserves being drained to pay the exorbitant interest on the loans Ethan now owned, he knew it was only a matter of time before they defaulted on the building's mortgage. He was not just maneuvering to bankrupt them. He was positioning himself to foreclose on their very identity. The final move of this phase was the most chilling. The Vances received a registered letter on the thick, intimidating stationery of Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch. It was a formal notice. On behalf of its client, Phoenix Holdings, the majority holder of their debt, the letter stated that due to a breach of several financial covenants related to their debt-to-equity ratio, all their outstanding loans were being consolidated and restructured. The interest rate was being increased, and a member of a creditors committee, appointed by Phoenix, would now require weekly oversight of all major financial decisions. They were no longer the masters of their own company. They were tenants, operating at the mercy of an unknown, unseen, and utterly ruthless landlord. The letter was a death warrant, and they didn't even know the name of their executioner. Life under the creditors committee was a slow, public strangulation. The Vances, a family who had never answered to anyone, were now forced to justify every decision to a stone-faced lawyer from Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch. This man, a proxy for the faceless Phoenix Holdings, attended their board meetings like a silent executioner, his presence a constant reminder that they were no longer in control. Julian's reckless proposals were dismissed with a quiet, "The creditor will not approve that expenditure." Eleanor's attempts to use company funds for a lavish charity ball were met with a firm, "That is not a fiscally responsible use of assets at this time." They were puppets in their own boardroom, their strings pulled by an invisible master. Ethan managed their decline with the precision of a demolition expert. He didn't want the company to collapse chaotically. He wanted it to be hollowed out, leaving only the empty shell of their legacy. He allowed enough cash flow to pay the employees and the most essential suppliers, maintaining a facade of operation. But the immense interest payments on the debt payments that flowed directly into Phoenix's coffers and the gaping wound of their past failures ensured there was never enough left over for the truly significant bills. The day Ethan had been planning for finally arrived. It came not with a bang, but with a quiet, formal notice of default. Vance Enterprises had missed the multi-million-dollar quarterly mortgage payment on the Vance Tower. The bank, which had held the mortgage for decades, had no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings. The news was a public relations catastrophe. The Vance name, once a symbol of New York real estate power, was now officially linked to failure. The sharks smelled blood in the water. The Vances were in a state of frantic panic, trying to scrape together financing for a last-minute deal, preparing for the humiliation of a public auction where their greatest monument would be sold off to the highest bidder. They were so consumed by their public disgrace that they failed to notice the silent, decisive transaction happening behind the scenes. Ethan had no intention of participating in the circus of a public auction. It was too unpredictable, too public. His methods were silent and absolute. Phoenix Holdings, through Mr. Vance's firm, approached the bank directly. Their proposal was an answer to the bank's prayers. They offered to buy the entire defaulted mortgage note, a massive liability on the bank's books, for 95 cents on the dollar, payable in cash, immediately. The bank wouldn't have to deal with the costs and uncertainties of an auction. They would simply offload the entire problem for a clean, instant, and massive cash payment. The bank's board of directors approved the deal in less than an hour. The transaction was completed in 48 hours. With the stroke of a pen in a quiet law office, the ownership of the debt on the Vance Tower was transferred. Phoenix Holdings was now the mortgage holder. The Vances still thought they were fighting the bank. They had no idea that the ghost that haunted their business had now taken possession of their home. It was Eleanor who made the final, desperate gambit. Broken, but not yet defeated, she believed that if she could only face her tormentor, she could change her fate. She clung to the outdated belief in her own power, in the mystique of the Vance name. She instructed her lawyers to formally request a meeting with the principal owner of Phoenix Holdings. She intended to negotiate, to plead, perhaps even to threaten, whatever it took to save her family from complete ruin. It was the desperate roar of a dying lioness, still believing her roar could frighten the vultures away. The request was sent, a message in a bottle cast into a hostile sea. The Vances waited for days, the silence from the other side stretching their nerves to the breaking point. They expected a refusal, or perhaps a summons to a sterile, neutral law office where they would be dictated terms of surrender. The reply, when it finally came, was more chilling than any of them could have imagined. It was a single sheet of Cromwell, Sterling, and Finch's heavy, cream-colored stationery. The letter was brief and devoid of any pleasantries. It stated simply that their request for a meeting had been granted. A date and time were provided for the following week. But it was the last line of the letter, the line detailing the location, that made the blood run cold. The meeting will be held in the main boardroom, 50th floor, Vance Tower. They read it, and then read it again. It made no sense. It was an act of supreme, almost contemptuous audacity. Why would this mysterious enemy, who had systematically dismantled their lives from the shadows, agree to meet them here, in their own sanctuary? In the very heart of their power, a space that was, for now, still technically theirs? Isabella was terrified. Julian was suspicious, seeing a trap in every word. But Eleanor, in a final, fatal surge of her indomitable pride, interpreted it differently. She saw it as a mistake, a crack in her enemy's armor. To come to her home was to cede the advantage. On the 50th floor, surrounded by portraits of Vance ancestors and the symbols of their long-held power, she believed she could still be a queen. She believed she could win. She had no way of knowing that she was not a queen preparing to defend her castle. She was a condemned prisoner, being graciously invited to attend her own execution in the comfort of her former throne room. The air in the 50th floor boardroom was thin and electric. For the Vances, this room had always been a fortress, a sanctuary of their power, perched high above the city that they considered their dominion. The long, polished mahogany table had been the site of triumphs and dynastic decisions for 3 generations. The portraits of Eleanor's father and grandfather, stern men of industry, stared down from the walls, their painted eyes serving as silent judges. But today, the room felt like a cage. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her spine ramrod straight, a queen attempting to project authority over a kingdom that was already lost. Her face was a mask of defiant composure, but a slight, persistent tremor in her hands betrayed the fear beneath. Across from her, Julian vibrated with a caged animal energy, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He was a prince reduced to a supplicant, and he hated it. And at the far end of the table, Isabella sat pale and silent, a ghost at her own family's funeral, twisting a diamond ring on her finger, as if the familiar weight of it could anchor her to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. They were waiting for a monster, a faceless corporate raider, a titan of industry who had brought their house to its knees. The silence was broken by the soft chime of the private elevator. They all tensed. They heard the heavy glass doors of the reception area swing open, followed by the sound of calm, measured footsteps on the marble floor. Their own lawyer, a man who had served their family for 20 years, opened the boardroom door. His face was ashen, his eyes avoiding theirs. He simply held the door open and stepped aside. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted for a moment against the bright light of the outer office. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit of such perfect, understated tailoring that it seemed to absorb the light around it. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the scene with a quiet, analytical intensity. Then he stepped into the light. Isabella gasped, a sharp, strangled sound that was swallowed by the thick carpet. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. Julian's face contorted, shifting from angry confusion to pure, sputtering rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snarled, half rising from his chair. "The help's entrance is in the basement. Get out." Eleanor did not speak. She simply stared, her carefully constructed mask of composure cracking like a dropped vase. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument for calculating social and financial hierarchies, refused to process the data her eyes were providing. The man standing before her was Ethan, but it was not the Ethan she knew. The quiet, accommodating, slightly lost man she had tormented for 5 years was gone. This man was a stranger. There was no trace of the eager-to-please husband in his posture, no hint of the deferential son-in-law in his eyes. His gaze was as cold and clear as a winter sky, and in it she saw not a hint of fear or deference, but the calm, unassailable certainty of absolute power. Ethan ignored Julian's outburst as one might ignore the barking of a small dog. He walked calmly, deliberately, to the head of the table, to the chair where Eleanor sat, the throne of her power. He did not ask her to move. He simply stood there, his presence an undeniable claim. After a long, suffocating moment of silence, Eleanor, for the first time in her life, looked away. She shrank back in her chair, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that was, in fact, a total surrender. Ethan placed his hands on the back of the chair. He looked at Julian, his expression unreadable. "I believe you're mistaken," he said, his voice quiet, yet it filled the room, silencing every other sound. "The person who needs to get out is you." He then let his gaze drift from Julian to Isabella and finally to Eleanor. "You requested a meeting with the principal of Phoenix Holdings. I am here." Julian laughed, a harsh, incredulous bark. "You? You're a nobody, a piece of trash we scraped off our shoe." "I was," Ethan corrected him, his voice still unnervingly calm. "But a lot can change in 2 years. While you were busy driving your family's legacy into the ground, I was busy building something new." He gestured around the room. "Phoenix Holdings owns your debt, Julian, every last dollar. The loans you took out, the bonds your father issued. I own it all." He let that sink in before delivering the next blow. "And when you inevitably defaulted on the mortgage for this building, I bought that too. The deal with the bank was finalized last week." He looked directly at Eleanor, the architect of his humiliation. "So let me be perfectly, unequivocally clear. Welcome to my boardroom. You are sitting at my table, in my building. I am your creditor. I am your landlord." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "And your tenancy is over." The illusion shattered. The world tilted on its axis. Julian, finally comprehending, let out a primal roar of rage and lunged across the table toward Ethan, but he never made it. 2 large, impeccably dressed men who had entered silently behind Ethan stepped forward, intercepting Julian with practiced, brutal efficiency, pinning his arms behind his back. His pathetic struggle lasted only a moment before he was immobilized. Isabella began to sob, her pleas a pathetic, broken whisper. "Ethan, please, I'm sorry. I was a fool. I never meant. Please, don't do this. Ethan looked at her, his wife, the woman he had once loved with a devotion that had nearly cost him his soul. He looked at her, and he felt nothing. She was a bad investment he had finally written off the books. Sorry is a word you use when you bump into a stranger, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. What you did requires a vocabulary you are not capable of. He then turned his full attention to the broken woman at the head of the table. Eleanor was staring at him, her face a canvas of utter defeat. The fight was gone. The pride was gone. All that remained was the chilling, soul-crushing understanding of her monumental miscalculation. The man she had deemed worthless had just seized her entire world. Ethan had no more words for them. There was nothing left to say. Justice, he had learned, was not about shouting or vengeance. It was about the quiet, irreversible changing of facts. And the fact was, they were finished. My security will escort you from the building, he said, his tone as final as a judge's gavel. You will be allowed to collect your personal effects from the penthouse. The rest is no longer your concern. He turned his back on them then. A final, complete dismissal. He walked to the vast window and looked out at the city skyline, at the endless panorama of steel and glass that was now his. He heard the sounds behind him. Julian's muffled curses, Isabella's weeping, the quiet footsteps as his security team escorted the ghosts of the Vance dynasty out of his office and out of his life, forever. The aftermath of a lightning strike is a moment of deafening silence, the air thick with the smell of ozone and finality. In the boardroom, the Vances were suspended in that silence, their world incinerated in a single, brilliant flash of truth. Julian, held fast by the unyielding grip of the security men, had stopped struggling, his face a mask of sweat and disbelief. Isabella's sobs had subsided into silent, shuddering breaths. Eleanor sat perfectly still, a statue of a queen whose kingdom had turned to dust at her feet. Ethan did not move to comfort or to gloat. The time for emotion was long past. This was the audit, the final accounting of a family whose moral and financial bankruptcy was now due. He turned from the window and, with a remote, activated the large presentation screen on the wall. It lit up, casting a cold, blue glow over their pale faces. Before you are escorted out, Ethan said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand, I think it's important for you to understand the full scope of your mismanagement. Consider this, your exit interview. The first slide appeared. It was the logo of Vance Enterprises, but with a red line through it. Beneath it, a series of documents and spreadsheets began to populate the screen. Let's begin with you, Julian, Ethan said, not even looking at him, his eyes fixed on the data. Exhibit A, the Dubai Hotel venture. You presented it to the board as a flagship project. What you failed to mention were the shell corporations you set up to handle construction contracts. He clicked the remote. Bank statements from the Cayman Islands filled the screen, showing multi-million-dollar transfers. These are the kickbacks from the contractors you hired. A total of $18 million, which you classified as cost overruns. He moved to the next slide. Then there was the acquisition of the luxury textile company, a deal which lost this company $70 million in a single year. You claimed it was a market downturn. The truth is you bought it from a shell company owned by your friend at 3 times its market value. Julian's face went from white to green. He was no longer a failed executive. He was a common criminal, his petty thefts laid bare for all to see. Ethan's attention then shifted. Isabella, he said, and for the first time, a flicker of something not pity, but a cold, academic interest entered his voice. The screen changed to show the incorporation documents for the LLC she had set up with Lucas. He then displayed the meticulous record of her financial transfers. You were so careful, moving your money to protect it from the dead weight you were about to discard. He let the words hang in the air. Her own cruel phrase turned back on her like a knife. But you made a classic mistake, Ethan continued. You fell for a story. You believed in pedigree. A new set of documents appeared on screen. Immigration records, police reports from 3 different countries. A mugshot of a handsome, smiling man. It was Lucas, Your fiancé, the man from a good family, is actually named Leo Schmidt. He's a professional predator. He has done this 4 times before, targeting insecure heiresses, draining their accounts, and disappearing. While you were picking out wedding venues, he was liquidating the last of your assets. He flew to Singapore last Tuesday. You have nothing left, Isabella. He took it all. Isabella let out a low moan, a sound of utter, soul-deep devastation. She had not only been betrayed by a lover, she had been played for the ultimate fool. Finally, Ethan turned his gaze to the silent woman at the head of the table. "And Eleanor," he said softly. "You, who judged me for my lack of breeding. You were the steward of this family's legacy." The screen filled with years of internal tax filings next to the official ones submitted to the IRS. The discrepancies were massive. Systematic tax fraud, using corporate accounts as a personal slush fund for decades, falsifying invoices to write off personal expenses, vacations, jewelry, cars. He presented the evidence with the dispassionate air of a scholar. "Your family didn't build this empire, Eleanor. You inherited it. And you treated it not as a responsibility, but as a right. You were not a titan of industry. You were a parasite, living off the carcass of your father's accomplishments." He clicked the remote, and the screen went black. The truth, stark and undeniable, filled the silence of the room. He walked over to a briefcase on a nearby credenza and placed it on the table. He opened it. It was filled with meticulously organized, bound dossiers. "I have compiled all of this evidence, and much more," he said. "This," he said, patting the briefcase, "is my copy." He then gestured to an identical briefcase next to it. That one contains exact duplicates, ready to be sent by messenger. One is addressed to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The other is for the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. He looked at them, 3 broken people in the ruins of their lives, and gave them their final choice. "Option 1, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You walk out of this building right now with nothing but what you are wearing. You sign a full and final release of any claims. You vanish from this city and from my life. If you do that, the second briefcase never leaves this room." He paused. "Option 2. You refuse. You try to fight me. You hire lawyers. And my messenger will have that second briefcase downtown before your car even reaches the street. You will spend what remains of your lives, and your money, fighting federal charges you cannot possibly beat." There was no negotiation. There was only the abyss, and the single, thorny branch he offered them to cling to. After a long, agonizing silence, it was Eleanor who gave the answer. She did not speak. She simply gave a single, sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Her dynasty was dead. Survival was all she had left. "A wise decision," Ethan said tonelessly. He slid a single piece of paper across the polished table. It was a formal eviction notice for the penthouse apartment upstairs, effective immediately. The final, bureaucratic nail in their coffin. "It's over," he said. "Go." The security men released Julian, who stumbled, his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed fear. Supported by the guards, the 3 of them, the tyrant, the fool, and the pawn, were led from the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, their reflections momentarily captured before vanishing. Justice was not a prison sentence. Justice was erasure. Ethan was left alone in the silent, cavernous room. He looked at the 2 briefcases on the table, the instruments of his victory, then turned back to the window, to the city that was now his. The storm was over. The silence that followed was his. Victory is a quiet, solitary thing. In the months that followed the fall of the House of Vance, Ethan did not celebrate. There were no lavish parties, no triumphant proclamations. The world knew only that Vance Enterprises had been acquired by the enigmatic Phoenix Holdings in a stunningly swift and silent takeover. The gossip columns whispered about the family's sudden, complete disappearance from the social scene, but the truth remained a secret, locked away in a briefcase in Ethan's office. The Vance Tower, once a monument to gaudy excess, was transformed. Ethan systematically stripped it of its arrogance. The ostentatious gold fixtures were replaced with clean, modern lines. The portraits of the Vance patriarchs were taken down and put into storage. The building was no longer a shrine to a name, but a functional, efficient hub of commerce. Ethan's true work was not in revenge, but in restoration. He spent not a single dollar of his new fortune on himself. Instead, he became a meticulous administrator of justice. He used the liquidated assets of the Vance empire to pay back every small vendor and contractor the family had cheated over the years. He established a generous fund for the rank-and-file employees, ensuring they all received severance packages and career transition services. His war had never been with them, and he was determined to clean up the collateral damage the Vances had left in their wake. He was not a conqueror, he was a liberator. One rainy afternoon, as the final stages of the corporate restructuring were underway, Ethan found himself in the private office of the late Richard Vance, a room that had been sealed since his death years ago. It was a museum of a bygone era, all dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint smell of cigar smoke. As his staff packed away the last of the personal effects, Ethan ran his hand along the edge of the massive, ornate mahogany desk. His fingers brushed against a section of the wood that felt loose. Piqued by curiosity, he pressed it. A hidden panel, seamless and invisible, clicked open, revealing a small, locked metal box. He pried it open with a letter opener. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two items: a single, folded letter, yellowed with age, and a small, black and white photograph. He picked up the photograph first. It showed two young men in their 20s, standing arm in arm on a muddy construction site, smiling with the unshakable optimism of youth. In the background, the steel skeleton of a building rose towards the sky. One of the men was a young, handsome Richard Vance. The other, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The other man, with his intense, intelligent eyes and quiet confidence, was unmistakably a young Alistair Blackwood. His hands trembling slightly, Ethan unfolded the brittle letter. It was written in Richard Vance's handwriting, and it was an unsent confession addressed to Alistair. It spoke of their shared dream, of starting a company from nothing, two brilliant, ambitious friends against the world. It detailed how Richard, consumed by greed and envy of his partner's genius, had used a series of legal and financial betrayals to systematically push Alistair out, stealing the company they had built together, leaving his best friend with nothing. "I stole your dream, Ollie," the letter confessed in a shaky scrawl. "This entire empire, this building, this name, it was all built on the foundations of what I did to you, and my guilt is the one debt I can never repay." In that instant, the entire story of Ethan's life rearranged itself into a new, profound, and chilling pattern. Alistair's interest in him hadn't been a coincidence. The ledger hadn't just been a gift. Alistair, from his quiet exile, had spent decades watching the man who had betrayed him build a dynasty on his stolen dream. He had waited, with the patience of a glacier, for a crack to appear in their corrupt foundation. And then he had found Ethan, a man with the intelligence to understand the game and the integrity to see it through, a man who had been wronged by the same family. Ethan finally understood. He had not been an agent of his own revenge. He had been the unwitting executor of a dead man's will, the instrument of a justice that had been waiting half a century to be served. His personal pain, his humiliation, had simply been the key that unlocked a much older, much larger story of betrayal and reckoning. He hadn't just taken down a corrupt family. He had, in a way, restored a stolen legacy to its rightful line of succession, passed down from a wronged master to a worthy apprentice. The weight of his victory shifted, transforming from something personal and vengeful into something vast, historical, and deeply resonant. He had not merely won a war, he had balanced the scales of a lifetime. He looked down at the photograph of the two young friends, and then out the vast window of the tower that should have always been Alistair's. Justice, he realized, is not always a thunderclap from the heavens. Sometimes, it is the quiet, patient work of a lifetime. It is a debt passed down through decades, finally collected not with a sword, but with a ledger. And it is a reminder that you must never, ever underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For when he finally moves, he carries not only the weight of his own pain, but the righteous fury of ghosts. Thank you for listening. Join us next time, as another door opens, revealing the dark secrets hidden behind the perfect facade of another family.